Hey guys, Heidi Preeb here. This week on this channel, we are talking about the early experiences of each of the 4 attachment styles. So that is anxious, avoidant, fearful avoidant, and secure. And today we're going to be talking about the early experiences of the fearful avoidant individual. Now, fearful avoidance is one of the most heavily, I'm not going to say contested, yes, I am. I'm going to say contested. One of the most heavily contested attachment styles in the sense of many different people disagree on how this attachment style gets formed, as well as how early experiences correlate to the adult experience of the fearful avoidant attachment style. So we're going to go over some of the different theories today, but mostly what we're going to do is draw on the themes that run parallel in all of those theories, because there are more similarities than differences in many cases when it comes to this style. So fearful avoidance is highly correlated with disorganized attachment in infants. Infants with a disorganized attachment style were given that name because in the strange situation procedure, which is how we assess infant attachment, these were children who did not show evidence of a organized attachment response. So what that means is that when they study avoidant infants, they find that they might show a consistent tendency to deal with danger and distress by disengaging from their attachment system and trying to self-soothe. And anxious infants might show a consistent pattern of elevating their attachment style when they're under distress and trying to get their caregiver's attention. And securely attached children might be really good at contextualizing when it's time to ask for attention versus when it's time to self-soothe. But disorganized children were named as such because they didn't show a clear, coherent, organized strategy in any direction. So it was not that they were consistently trying to self-soothe, nor was it that they were consistently trying to look for protection when they were under distress. And unlike the securely attached infant, they were not able to really understand when it was time to do which. So what you might see with disorganized infants is this kind of approach avoidance pattern with their caregiver, where they might start moving towards their caregiver when they were scared, and then kind of freeze and stop moving towards them or kind of start going in the opposite direction. And it appeared as though they were not clear on whether they wanted attachment or whether they did not want attachment. And of course, theories began developing around why this would be the case. So why would we have a child who was disoriented about what to do when they were under distress? So one of the original theories that developed around this is that these were children who were afraid of their caregivers. So if there was danger in their environment, they might instinctively start to get closer to their caregiver, which is in most cases a secure attachment response. But then something in their body might kind of remind them this isn't a safe person, so they'll freeze or they'll back away. So there is this almost disorientation around whether or not they should go to their caregiver or whether they should stay where they are and try to protect themselves from their caregiver. Now, when you're an infant, your caregiver is your access to everything in life. So if your caregiver is a threat to your environment, if your caregiver is extremely abusive, for example, and you associate fear for your life with your caregiver, this will, of course, create a disorienting range of behaviors. Because imagine if the person who was giving you everything you need to stay alive was also the person threatening your life. It would be very confusing trying to figure out, when do I do what? Because in some situations, they're giving me the things that I need to continue staying alive. But in other situations, they are actually the reason why I think I might not remain alive. And again, this doesn't actually mean that the caregiver is necessarily trying to kill the child. It can feel to the child like their survival is threatened without their survival truly being threatened. But it could also be the case that their caregiver is truly that endangering. But the result is that the child does not develop a coherent, cohesive view of whether attachment figures are safe or unsafe. And so it gets very difficult for them to plan their behavior around how to approach or not approach the attachment figure. Now again, keep in mind here that the way children, especially infants, process the world is not the same as the way adults process the world. So as an adult, we might say, well, my caregiver wasn't that scary. I never thought my caregiver was trying to kill me. But put yourself in the shoes of a 1-year-old. And let's say you have a parent with PTSD, or borderline personality disorder, or some other psychological challenge that causes them to kind of lose control of themselves. As an infant, all you know is that you are suddenly and unexpectedly in the vicinity of someone who is 20 times your size and who is completely out of control of themselves. Now, if you put any adult in a room with an animal that is 20 times bigger than themselves, and that animal is angry and completely out of control of their anger, you bet your ass you are going to be terrified as an adult. You're going to feel like, I don't know what to do. Do I try to befriend this animal? Do I try to run away from it? And that is the precise predicament that the infant is in if they have a parent who is out of control of themselves. This could also be the case if the parent is sometimes on drugs. This could be the case if the parent is intermittently violent with the child. There are many ways, some of which involve physical abuse, some of which do not, that could cause the infant to believe that their parent is a threat to their life. And that is one of the theories around how a disorganized attachment style forms in infants, which could result in a fearful-avoidant attachment style in adults. With the fearful-avoidant attachment style in adults, you see that same kind of approach-avoidance conflict. So you don't really know as an adult, are relationships good or are they bad? And you'll maybe kind of get close to someone and then get triggered in a way you don't understand and all of a sudden want nothing to do with them or want to get out of that sense of intimacy. That could be because your early experiences of relationships, they were life-sustaining, and other times they were life-threatening. So you might get overwhelmed by a barrage of very different opposing feelings within a singular relationship as an adult because your worldview formed around the early belief that people you are close to will not behave predictably and they will sometimes behave in a threatening way. And a survival threat does not have to be occurring for you as an adult to feel an emotional flashback to that early experience, to feel scared, to feel threatened, to feel for some reason that you need to remove yourself from that situation. But one theory on fearful-avoidant attachment is that when they were young, the same person they went to for comfort and support and having their physical needs met was the same person who served as a threat to them. So what they internalized about relationships is pursue them, you need them to be okay, but don't relax into them. Always stay on guard, stay hypervigilant. Really notice for signs that something might go wrong at any moment and be ready to get out of there the second that happens. And interestingly, with the fearful-avoidant attachment style, something that characterizes this style is that they become the most resistant and the most kind of activated in relationships when things are going right. So arriving at a place in a relationship where things are calm and open and loving and communicative can actually feel terrifying for the fearful-avoidant adult because they believe this is when something's about to go wrong. Something is going to happen any minute that flips this on its head. So they might be prone to sabotaging the relationship at that point before that thing that their nervous system believes is going to go wrong goes wrong. And it's really important to note that this wiring is occurring on a nervous system level. So it's not that your conscious brain is saying get close but not too close. It's that your conscious brain might be saying get close, and then your nervous system is saying I'm not going to relax, I need to stay on guard, and I'm going to freak out at the slightest sign of danger. And that's exactly what ends up happening. So the adult with a fearful-avoidant style still sees intimacy as valuable and close relationships as something they should pursue. And they might have lots of fantasies about an intimate relationship. But when you're alone and you're fantasizing, your nervous system can be relatively calm because it's not wired for attack, because that threatening stimuli, intimacy, is not there. But then as soon as a fearful-avoidant actually starts experiencing intimacy, that's when that nervous system reactivates and all of a sudden they want to get out of there. And this can be so confusing for the adult who believes that they want one thing, but as soon as they get it, all of a sudden they're freaking out and don't want it anymore. And that is very often the felt conscious experience of the fearful-avoidant, who might get very disoriented about thinking they want one thing and then freaking out and feeling like they're self-sabotaging as soon as they get it. That's actually because your nervous system is now coming online to protect you against attack the second you get intimate with someone, which you might on a cognitive level actually really want. So there'll be this pattern of getting close, freaking out, taking space, in many cases breaking the relationship off, and then once you're alone again and your nervous system is calm, you start thinking, I could go for a relationship, I feel good now, I feel okay. So it is very disorienting for the adult fearful-avoidant, who ironically, it's like their body and their nervous system can only tolerate the experience of true intimacy when it's not present for them, when they're actually literally at a safe distance from it. And this is different from the avoidant style, who doesn't have that same kind of conscious drive towards relationships in the first place. They don't kind of crave intimacy in the same way that the fearful avoidant does. So it doesn't create as much of kind of an emotional roller coaster as it does for the fearful avoidant, who wants in then wants out and doesn't understand themselves why that's happening. Now again, this is only one theory of fearful avoidance. It is not commonly agreed upon that this is absolutely how fearful avoidance develops, and it's also not commonly agreed upon that this is the only cause of disorganized attachment. Many things can cause disorganized attachment, including not really having a consistent caregiver. So let's say in the case of a child who grew up in an orphanage where they never had one consistent person who attended to them, cases of overt caregiver abuse. But I also want to take the time in this video to bring up the dynamic maturation model of attachment, which takes a different view on disorganization. Patricia Crittenden, who worked under Mary Ainsworth, who was the person who developed the strange situation procedure, which is how infant attachment was categorized, developed a theory called the dynamic maturation model of attachment, in which she argued that many children who get categorized as disorganized actually have a best fit type within the system she developed called the DMM that looked at the categories of anxious and avoidant attachment as more of a gradient that had many subscales within it. So you might have a child who appears disorganized in the strange situation procedure, but as they grow up, develops a very sophisticated and strategic response to their family environment that might look disorganized, but is actually meeting their needs quite effectively given the family environment they're growing up in, which is not necessarily a healthy environment. So essentially the theory behind the DMM is that children are always adapting themselves the best they can to the environment they're given. So it's not that having an avoidant or an anxious attachment style, or even a fearful avoidant attachment style, which is not an official classification within the DMM, but I will talk in a minute about the kind of parallel classification in the DMM. But the DMM argues that the child is always developing a strategy that will help it survive the environment it is in. So, a child who, let's say, is actually quite anxious and actually really needs attention from their caregiver, but who learn, if I display my anger in kind of a very cool and controlling way, I'm more likely to get what I need than I am if I overtly display my anger. So in the traditional model of attachment, a child who does not overtly display anger and vulnerability might not be classified as anxious. However, the kind of cool, disinterested persona that they're putting out there might actually be a strategy designed to get them the attention and nurturance of their caregiver, as opposed to a strategy where they are truly not experiencing their anger or their need, like the avoidantly attached style. So the reason why this is important is that a child might look like they fall into a certain attachment category based on their behavior, but the DMM places a really big emphasis on looking at why they're behaving the way they are. What is their end goal? And to be fair, the traditional model of attachment does deal with this as well, but the DMM deals with it in a lot more detail, and some of the attachment responses that get missed in the traditional model get picked up on by the DMM. And in the dynamic maturation model of development, it is possible to have what they call an unintegrated AC strategy. So the DMM does not use the categories of anxious and avoidant the same way the traditional model does. They use the classifications of A and C. And those classifications are actually just the original categories that Ainsworth classified the children under in the strange situation. So when they first began assessing infant attachment, they didn't say anxious, avoidant, secure, and disorganized. They said this cluster of responses we'll just call category A, this cluster we'll just call category B, and so on and so forth. So eventually, cluster A became known in the traditional model as avoidant. Cluster B became known as secure, and cluster C became known as anxious. So in the DMM model, we have A, which in the traditional model correlates to avoidant attachment. We have C, which in the traditional model correlates to anxious attachment. And we have B, which in the traditional model correlates to secure attachment, but they call it balanced in this model. And it is possible to have a strategy that they call an unintegrated AC strategy, which means you will use in an unintegrated way both an avoidant strategy and an anxious strategy depending on the situation. Now, this is contrasted with the B strategy, who will use both anxious and avoidant strategies in a healthy and integrated way. So securely attached people use their emotions to help them decide what to do, and they use their logic to help them understand what they feel. But with someone who is using an AC strategy, they're only focusing on what they think or how they feel at a given point in time. So they are kind of operating against themselves in many ways, because they might make a decision based on logic and then later be in a situation where it calls for them to access their emotional self and then make a different or counter decision based on their emotional experience, and kind of ricochet between those two extremes for their entire life unless and until they do the work in psychotherapy of integrating the parts of themselves that rely on distorted emotions to make decisions and the part of themselves that rely on distorted logic to make decisions. Because when we integrate emotion with logic in a balanced way, we become securely attached. But something else that the DMM provides that's interesting in relation to this attachment strategy, which does kind of loosely correlate to the experiences of the fearful avoidant, but is described differently. So again, to make this clear, If you have the categorization of fearful-avoidant in the traditional model of attachment, you may or may not be classified as AC unintegrated in the DMM model. It might be that one of the subclassifications of the categories that correspond to anxious and avoidant in the DMM are actually a best fit for you. Because again, wherever there's more nuance, there's more ability to categorize. However, if you are fearful avoidant and you have an AC unintegrated strategy in the DMM model, there are additional theories that come up about how that may have been developed for you. So one of the theories is that adults who have an unintegrated AC strategy grew up in households where, for whatever reason, they had to develop completely different attachment responses to different caregivers. Now, this is really important to note. You do not necessarily have to develop a different strategy to deal with a caregiver who has a different strategy than your primary caregiver. So for example, let's say you were raised by an anxious mother and an avoidant father. You might develop an anxious attachment style in relation to your mother, and then you might use that same strategy to try to form a relationship with your father. Generally, the attachment styles we form around our relationship with whoever our primary caregiver is. So if your primary caregiver was your father, meaning he was the one that you spent the most time with, who most often fed you, who most often was responsive to your emotional and physical needs when they came up, that might be who your primary caregiver is. For most infants, it is the mother, especially if the child is being breastfed, because the mother is using her own body to meet the infant's needs. But of course, there might be a situation where the child has two fathers or one father or whatever it is, and so it's not that a mother is always the child's primary attachment figure. However, they're often the child's primary attachment figure. So we form our attachment styles mostly in relation to our primary attachment figure. And if, let's say, an anxious strategy works on mom, so when we really amplify and make clear what our needs are, mom at least some of the time responds to that, we don't necessarily need to develop a different strategy for dad if dad is not necessarily all that important in getting our needs met. Generally, as children, we form our attachment strategy around our primary caregiver, and then we use that strategy on our other caregiver. And if the same strategy that works on mom doesn't work on dad, we might try a slightly adapted strategy, and maybe we find that works on dad. But in the case of infants who develop an AC strategy, it might be that for whatever reason, they really did have to develop radically different responses to deal with different parents. Let's say you have an infant with divorced parents, so they spend half of their time at mom's house and half of their time at dad's house. And mom is completely and totally different in terms of what she responds to than dad is. I'm using very heteronormative examples just because it's less words to say mom and dad than like mom who breastfeeds and mom who doesn't breastfeed or whatever. But of course you can generalize this to relationships that are not heteronormative. So there are situations where the child is completely dependent on the different parents for their needs being met for long periods of time, but the parents respond in drastically different ways to the child. That could lead to the development of an AC strategy because they learn to use an avoidant response with their dad, but an anxious response with their mom. And now there are these two unintegrated ways of approaching human relationships that might come out for the child in different relationships as they grow up. But for myriad reasons, that one's a little bit less common just because usually there's at least some adaptation of the primary attachment strategy that we develop that will work even on a parent with a different attachment strategy. So for example, let's say a young boy might show vulnerability with his mother in order to get his needs met, but he finds that dad kind of doesn't approve of young boys showing vulnerability. So with dad, maybe he learns to bring out that angry side of his anxious attachment strategy more often. And dad finds anger to be acceptable in young boys, so dad responds to that. So it's more likely that when we have parents who have different attachment strategies themselves, we will find different parts of our own strategy to bring out in relation to them, as opposed to developing completely different attachment strategies for each of our parents. Simply because that is a lot more work for the brain to do, to develop two completely different strategies and keep them compartmentalized in our brain. So the brain will always try to do what's easiest, which is why it's more likely that a child will first try to use their strategy in different ways on the other parent, and very often that does work. Now, another way, according to the DMM, you could develop an unintegrated AC pattern is by growing up in an environment in which you did not have the information that you needed available to you in order to make sense of your experience. Now, this could also be the development of an anxious strategy, but in this case, it's often a situation where meaningful information is being withheld from the child in a way that causes very big consequences for them. So, as an example, let's say dad is having an affair and mom feels like like her survival will be threatened if she calls dad out on his affair. Not because she necessarily thinks her husband is going to kill her, but maybe she thinks, oh, I can't fare in life without my husband, because maybe she's anxiously attached. Maybe it truly feels like a threat to her survival system to confront her partner about his affair and to deal with the consequences and the potential dissolving of the relationship as a consequence of that. So instead, mom unconsciously channels all of her anger onto the child that looks the most like dad. And every once in a while, she just freaks out on this kid. And it doesn't really have any sort of rhyme or reason, because maybe the days that mom is freaking out the most on this kid are the days in which she's most suspicious of dad's behavior. But the child doesn't have any way to predict whatsoever which days they are going to get harshly punished by mom and which days they are not. So again, that kind of approach avoidance conflict can exist in the child's mind of, does it make sense for me to get close to mom today and to show her my needs? Or does it make sense for me to completely detach and to try to self-soothe? And based on the mindset that mom happens to be in, one or the other might get the child either caught in a giant rage storm or have their needs met. So the child becomes unable to rely on logic because there is no logic behind when their mom is freaking out on them and when they're not. But they also can't rely on their own emotional experiences to be a predictor of whether or not their needs will be met. They can learn to rely a little bit on both strategies, depending on what is going to get them through a given moment the most effectively. And so they learn to always be kind of hyper tuned in to both the emotions that are going on in their environment with their caregiver, but also any clues that might point to why this behavior is so erratic. However, because they are never given any true confirmation in either department about why these things are happening the way that they are, because the true cause is being obscured from them, this might lead to the development of an unintegrated AC strategy. Because for it to be integrated would require them having access to the truth about why things are happening the way that they're happening in their household. And you can see here the parallels between this unintegrated AC strategy and the fearful-avoidant style, who is constantly kind of alert and on guard for what might be happening that they're not aware of. Now again, the anxious strategy in both systems does also have that kind of hyper alert, hyper attuned strategy, but what they're watching for is signs that they might be abandoned. Whereas the fearful avoidant, or in the DMM, the person who has an AC strategy, is more trying to make sense of the world using distorted logic, as well as trying to make sense of the world using distorted emotion, but never at the same time. And this is juxtaposed with the anxious attachment strategy, which is always trying to use emotion to fill in the blanks. So they rarely kind of step back and really detach from their emotional experience and try to figure out in a kind of cold, hard, logical sequence why A, B, or C is happening in their relationships. The AC strategy will sometimes feel completely detached from their emotional experience, and they'll be able to analyze the human condition from a very distanced viewpoint, where they can internalize some very harsh viewpoints about themselves and other people. And then in other situations, they will be very centered in that emotional experience and reacting very strongly to it. But anyway, all of this exploration of both of those systems is simply to say that fearful avoidance learned very early on in life that you cannot really let your guard down, you cannot relax into intimacy and close relationships because they are not reliable, but also intimate relationships are incredibly important to the point where they might be life-sustaining to pursue them. So you ought to pursue these relationships, but also never relax into them and trust them. And this creates this very deep inner conflict in the fearful avoidant, where they're constantly trying to enter into relationships and then get out of them in a way that might feel very disorienting for both them and other people. And again, it's important to note here that this is not your fault. As a fearful avoidant, you did not choose this way of being, you did not cause yourself to have this inner conflict, but many fearful avoidants do blame themselves and do feel like, oh, I must just be a fuckboy, I'm just someone who doesn't really care about other people, and there can be these very harsh inner judgments that happen, but you're not enjoying this. You are not enjoying the experience of not knowing whether you want to stay or go in any of your close relationships, of breaking up with someone and then being panicked and wanting to go back to them 2 weeks later and not understanding these humongous oscillations that you go through. That is not fun for the fearful avoidant, and they would not choose it. And if this is your style, I believe wholeheartedly, and I know because there is evidence on this, that you did not choose this style. It would not have been possible for you to choose it because your worldview formed as a reaction to what you internalized at a very young age about intimate relationships, and then your brain became hardwired around that. Now, there is the opportunity to change it. And for the fearful avoidant, it is more work to change it because you're dealing with both the avoidant triggers and the anxious triggers. So it's kind of like you're getting hit from both angles, but the brilliance is that because you do have access to your emotional self and your logical self, there is at least a basis for starting to work with integrating those things in a healthier, more accurate way so that you can flip that worldview, because the fearful avoidant worldview really is the opposite of the secure worldview. The securely attached worldview is I'm okay, other people are okay. And the fearful avoidant worldview is I am not okay, other people are not okay. So I can't trust other people, but I also can't trust myself. And because you do at least have both of those worldviews in your conscious awareness, albeit at completely different points, so you might have almost state-dependent memory of these different states of being. With the right help, you really can work on closing the gap between those worldviews by eventually learning to keep your emotional self online when you are rationalizing, and keeping your rational side online when you are feeling strong emotions. Currently, if you are in kind of active unconscious fearful avoidant patterning, only one of those parts of you is probably online at a given point in time. But the more you work through your attachment healing process, the more you're going to be able to eventually arrive at a place where, like the securely attached person, you can reason and you can feel simultaneously. And that will help you make more holistic decisions that will give you a singular direction in life, where both your feelings and your logical needs are accounted for at the same time. But what I want you to take away from this video is that if you have a fearful avoidant attachment style, that disorientation, that confusion, that kind of emotional storm that you might feel like you are perpetually caught up in is not happening because you are crazy. It's not happening because you're a bad person. It's not happening because you just don't know how to commit to things. It's happening because your very early experiences of life were disorienting. And so your mind did the absolute best it could to form a strategy that it believed would keep you safe. And that strategy has followed you throughout life. And now as an adult, if you can consciously recognize this strategy is no longer working for me because I am now in a safer environment than the one that I was in as a child, or I now have adult resources that will allow me to find a safer environment than I was in as a child, that is a brilliant place for the healing work to begin. It is a long process, but the views only get better the higher you hike, right? I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that I made a video called 10 Signs You May Have a Fearful Avoidant Attachment Style, and there were some comments that it felt like fearful avoidants were being criticized more heavily than the other styles. And I want to say none of this is meant to be criticism. I firmly believe if you have this style, you did not know how to behave in a different way because it was not modeled for you. And I also wholeheartedly believe that every single one of us would have done very different if we had been in an environment where behaving differently had been adaptive. That's how children are. Children do not make conscious moral decisions. They don't even have the capacity to moralize at a young age. They cannot even think about what's right and what's wrong. They don't have the awareness in their brain to do that yet. All they can do is react in a self-protective way. If you developed a fearful avoidant attachment style, there is a 100% chance you did it not because it was a moral failing on your part, but because you were protecting yourself the best way that you knew how, and I'm glad that you did that as a child. Maybe it's not working for you anymore, and if it's not working for you anymore, that's a good thing, because it means you are now in a safer environment, and you can learn the new rules and the new reactions that allow you to finally live in safety, right? I have spent about 2 years now working really intensively on my own fearful avoidant attachment style, and I can absolutely promise you that with the right help and the right resources, this can change drastically. And the way that you show up both with yourself and in relationships can change drastically, even if it doesn't feel like it from where you're standing now. So don't get discouraged if this or any of the other insecure styles apply to you. If you're in the place where it's causing problems in your life, it means that you are in a circumstance where more secure responses are warranted. And that's a good thing. That's a really good place to start from. All right, as always, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I am eternally curious about where all of you are at with your own attachment healing. Let me know what other videos you would like to see about the fearful avoidant attachment style as well. I'm currently planning my next couple months of videos, so throw any suggestions in the comments. And as always, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again really soon.